On January 28, 2025, President Trump issued an executive order freezing a significant portion of federal funding. This unprecedented move left state and local governments, nonprofits, and educational institutions scrambling to understand the implications. The funding freeze, temporarily blocked by a federal judge, has raised concerns about executive overreach and the future of vital programs. The White House's silence and vague language of the order created confusion as organizations tried to grasp the directive's scope and intent. The initial memo from the Office of Management and Budget did little to quell confusion. Released hastily, it lacked specifics, referring to a freeze on non-essential federal grants and loans. This ambiguity left federal agencies scrambling to interpret the directive. State and local governments reliant on federal funding were left in the lurch. The lack of clarity was a deliberate tactic by the Trump administration to maximize disruption. By keeping agencies in the dark, the administration could stall funds to programs deemed undesirable. At the heart of President Trump's funding freeze is a belief that the federal government has strayed from its core responsibilities. The administration argues that by freezing certain funds, they can redirect resources towards what they consider to be the true national priorities. This move is seen as a way to refocus the government's efforts on areas that directly impact the nation's security and economic stability. The freeze aims to redirect funding towards what the administration deems true national priorities. This includes bolstering defense, enhancing border security, and investing in infrastructure projects that promise to create jobs and stimulate economic growth. The administration believes that these areas have been neglected in favor of policies that do not serve the immediate needs of the American people. The freeze aims to redirect funding towards what the administration deems true national priorities. By reallocating resources, the administration hopes to address what it sees as the most pressing issues facing the country today. This includes not only national security and economic growth, but also reducing the federal deficit, which has been a long-standing concern for fiscal conservatives. Central to this vision is skepticism of policies related to climate change, diversity, and inclusion. The administration argues that these initiatives, while well-intentioned, often lead to excessive spending and regulatory overreach. They believe that the focus should be on practical solutions that deliver tangible results rather than on ideological commitments that may not have a direct impact on the average citizen's daily life. The administration aims to reduce the federal deficit and streamline bureaucracy. By cutting funding to programs they view as non-essential, they hope to make the government more efficient and less costly to taxpayers. This approach is part of a broader effort to reduce the size of the federal government and return more power to the states and local communities. Critics argue this vision is driven by ideology, not sound policymaking. They contend that the administration's approach is more about advancing a particular political agenda than about making decisions based on evidence and expert advice. These critics warn that the funding freeze could have unintended consequences, such as undermining important social programs and weakening the nation's ability to address complex challenges. They contend that targeted programs provide vital services and address critical challenges. Programs focused on healthcare, education, and social services play a crucial role in supporting vulnerable populations and promoting social equity. By cutting funding to these programs, critics argue, the administration risks exacerbating existing inequalities and leaving many Americans without the support they need. Slashing their funding risks exacerbating inequalities and undermining essential services. The debate over the funding freeze highlights the broader conflict between different visions of government's role in society. While the administration seeks to prioritize national security and economic growth, opponents emphasize the importance of social programs in creating a just and equitable society. The outcome of this debate will have significant implications for the future direction of federal policy and the lives of millions of Americans. The funding freeze's ripple effects were felt acutely at the state and local levels. Governments rely on federal grants for essential services like education, healthcare, and public safety. The sudden halt in funding left officials scrambling to assess the damage. With no clear guidance, states were forced to implement immediate cost-cutting measures. The most vulnerable segments of society are likely to bear the brunt of these cuts. This has sparked widespread outrage and anxiety about the potential social and economic turmoil. The funding freeze has sent tremors through the nonprofit sector. Nonprofits, which are the backbone of many community services, are now facing unprecedented challenges. The sudden halt in federal grants has left many organizations scrambling to find alternative sources of funding. This disruption is not just a financial issue, it's a crisis that affects the very fabric of our communities. Nonprofits rely on federal grants to deliver essential services. These services include food distribution, healthcare, education, and housing assistance. Without these grants, many of these critical programs are at risk. Volunteers and staff are working tirelessly to fill the gaps, but the strain is becoming too much to bear. The community's most vulnerable populations are the ones who will suffer the most. The disruption in funding has forced many to confront the possibility of program closures and staff layoffs. Offices that were once bustling with activity are now eerily quiet. Desks sit empty as staff members pack up their belongings, uncertain of what the future holds. The emotional toll on these dedicated workers is immense, as they grapple with the reality that their efforts to help others may be coming to an abrupt end. The uncertainty has made it difficult for nonprofit leaders to plan for the future. Board meetings are dominated by discussions of financial survival rather than program development. Leaders are poring over financial reports trying to stretch every dollar, but the numbers often don't add up. Planning sessions are filled with uncertain expressions as the future remains unclear. The constant state of flux is draining the morale of even the most resilient leaders. Demand for services has surged, driven by rising income inequality and the lingering effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. Food banks are seeing record numbers of people in need, but their shelves are often bare. Long lines form outside, with people waiting for hours, only to be turned away empty-handed. The pandemic has left many families in financial ruin, and the gap between the rich and the poor continues to widen. Many nonprofits are also grappling with shrinking donations. Economic uncertainty has made people more cautious with their money, and charitable giving has taken a hit. Donation bins that were once overflowing are now nearly empty. Fundraising events are seeing lower turnout, and the overall contributions have dwindled. This decline in donations is yet another blow to organizations already struggling to stay afloat. A prolonged funding freeze could cripple their ability to deliver vital services. Shuttered buildings and closed signs are becoming a common sight. Volunteers, who are the heart and soul of these organizations, are left distraught and helpless. The longer the funding freeze continues, the harder it will be to recover. The loss of these services would be a devastating blow to the communities that rely on them. This could have a devastating ripple effect on communities, exacerbating inequalities and eroding the social safety net. Families who depend on these services for basic needs like food, shelter, and healthcare will find themselves in even more precarious situations. The social fabric of neighborhoods will begin to fray, leading to increased crime, poor health outcomes, and a general decline in quality of life. The impact of this funding freeze is far-reaching, and its effects will be felt for years to come. The funding freeze looms large over the American education system. Federal funding supports educational opportunities and fosters innovation. Programs like Head Start face an uncertain future. K-12 schools could lose funding for special education and disadvantaged students. Higher education institutions are concerned about losing federal research grants and student financial aid. The president's actions threaten to disrupt this delicate ecosystem. This could hinder scientific breakthroughs, stifle innovation, and make higher education less accessible. The funding freeze extends beyond the U.S., affecting global aid programs. The decision to halt funding has been met with widespread condemnation. Critics argue it undermines America's standing and creates a vacuum for adversaries. Humanitarian organizations have been forced to suspend critical programs. Efforts to combat infectious diseases and provide disaster relief have been disrupted. The U.S. risks ceding its leadership role and undermining global development progress. This retreat could have far-reaching consequences for global security and economic stability. The funding freeze has ignited a firestorm of opposition. Across the nation, people are taking to the streets, voicing their discontent and demanding action. The freeze, which affects a wide range of public services, has been met with fierce resistance from various sectors of society. From healthcare to education, the impact is being felt far and wide. Legal challenges have been filed by state attorneys general and nonprofit groups. These legal battles are not just about the immediate effects of the funding freeze, but also about the broader implications for the rule of law and the balance of power. The attorneys general argue that the president's actions undermine the constitutional framework that governs the separation of powers. These lawsuits argue the president's actions are unconstitutional and exceed his authority. They claim that by bypassing Congress, the president has overstepped his bounds, setting a dangerous precedent for future administrations. The courts are now tasked with determining the legality of these actions, a process that could take months or even years. The political backlash has been fierce, with accusations of playing politics with people's lives. In Congress, heated debates have erupted, with lawmakers from both sides of the aisle expressing strong opinions. Some accuse the president of using the funding freeze as a political tool, while others argue that it is a necessary measure to address budgetary concerns. Democrats argue the freeze will devastate vulnerable communities and weaken public services. They point to the immediate effects on local programs that provide essential services such as food assistance, healthcare, and education. Community leaders are particularly vocal, highlighting the disproportionate impact on low-income families and marginalized groups. Some Republicans support the president, but others voice concerns about the freeze's abruptness. While some see it as a necessary step to rein in government spending, others worry about the long-term consequences and the lack of a clear plan to mitigate the impact on affected communities. This division within the party reflects broader tensions about the direction of fiscal policy. The public outcry has been swift, with protests erupting across the country. From major cities to small towns, people are coming together to voice their opposition. The protests are not just about the funding freeze itself, but also about broader concerns regarding government accountability and transparency. Citizens demand the president reverse course and restore funding for essential programs. They argue that the freeze is not only harmful, but also unjust, disproportionately affecting those who are already struggling. Community leaders and activists are at the forefront of these efforts, organizing rallies and speaking out against the policy. The nation watches as the legal battle unfolds, grappling with uncertainty and anxiety. News outlets provide constant updates, and the public remains engaged, eager to see how the situation will resolve. The outcome of this legal and political struggle will have far-reaching implications, not just for the current administration, but for the future of governance in the country. The nation awaits a final verdict on the funding freeze's legality. The temporary block by a federal judge provides a brief respite. The upcoming decision could reshape the balance of power between the executive and judicial branches. If upheld, the freeze would embolden the Trump administration to further its agenda. If struck down, it would curtail the administration's ability to impose its will unilaterally. The outcome will determine the fate of the funding freeze and shape public policy. The nation watches and waits, grappling with the uncertainty of a future hanging in the balance.